In the icy wilderness of Montana, Jack, a reclusive ex-firefighter burdened by personal tragedy, discovers two abandoned dogs on his doorstep during a brutal snowstorm. The larger German Shepherd, Hero, and a smaller, frightened dog lead Jack into a dark conspiracy of underground dog fighting rings. As Jack digs deeper, he uncovers a grim network exploiting animals for profit. Faced with ruthless criminals, Jack must decide whether to retreat into safety or confront the cruelty head-on. With Hero's unwavering loyalty and the help of a young man who defected from the ring, Jack wages a dangerous battle to rescue the trapped dogs and dismantle the network. The story crescendos in a dramatic confrontation at a hidden camp, where Jack outsmarts his foes, but a final warning note leaves him and the audience knowing the fight isn't over. This gripping tale of survival, courage, and redemption highlights the bond between humans and animals and the power of standing up for the voiceless. What do you think about Jack and Hero's journey? Where are you watching this story from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to DG Story for more captivating tales of bravery and resilience. Join us as we uncover stories that inspire, thrill, and move the heart. Stay tuned for the next adventure. The wind howled through the barren trees of the Montana forest, carrying with it a relentless cascade of snow that blanketed the ground in icy silence. Jack tightened his heavy coat and stared out the frosted window of his small cabin. For 3 years, this secluded refuge had been his sanctuary, a place to escape the world and bury the ghosts of his past. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth pushing back against the biting chill that seeped through the cabin walls. Jack sat in his worn armchair, a book resting in his lap. Though he wasn't reading, his eyes were fixed on the dancing flames, their flickering light casting shadows that seemed alive against the wooden walls. Once, Jack had been a firefighter, a man of action, of purpose. But the day he lost his 7-year-old son in a devastating house fire, something inside him broke. Despite his best efforts, he hadn't been able to save the boy, and the guilt had consumed him. The city, the people, the memories, they had all become unbearable. So he left, retreating to the vast, lonely wilderness where the only company was the wind and the trees. Tonight, the storm outside was particularly fierce, the kind that erased all traces of the world beyond the cabin's walls. Jack took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste grounding him momentarily. When he heard it, a faint sound, almost swallowed by the roar of the wind. Scratch, scratch. He frowned, setting his cup down. First, he thought it might be a tree branch scraping against the cabin. But the sound came again, more deliberate this time, accompanied by a low whine. His chest tightened. Living in the wilderness, he had learned to trust his instincts, and something about this noise felt wrong. Rising from his chair, Jack moved toward the door, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. He paused for a moment, listening. The sound persisted. Scratch, whine, scratch. Steeling himself, he unlatched the door and cracked it open. A blast of icy wind slammed into him, carrying flurries of snow inside. He squinted against the cold and saw it. A large German Shepherd, its fur matted with snow and its body trembling violently. Its ribs jutted out beneath its coat, and its eyes, clouded with pain, locked onto his. "Jesus," Jack muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The dog staggered forward but collapsed before it could reach the threshold. Without hesitation, Jack bent down, scooping the limp animal into his arms. His body was frigid, the fur damp and coarse against his hands. "Hang in there, buddy," he murmured as he kicked the door shut behind him. He carried the dog to the fireplace and laid it gently on the thick rug, quickly grabbing a blanket to drape over its shivering form. For a moment, Jack stood there, staring at the dog. It had appeared out of nowhere, in the middle of a storm that could easily kill a man. But what haunted him most wasn't its sudden arrival. It was the look in its eyes, desperate, pleading, as if it had chosen his door for a reason. The German Shepherd lay motionless by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick blanket as Jack knelt beside it. His hands moved methodically, gently rubbing the dog's sides to generate warmth. The flames crackled steadily, their glow illuminating the dog's matted fur and thin, emaciated frame. "Where the hell did you come from?" Jack muttered, his voice low, almost to himself. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, a small victory against the biting cold that had nearly claimed it. After a moment, Jack stood and moved to the kitchen. He filled a small bowl with lukewarm water and set it down near the dog's nose. "Drink," he said softly, crouching beside it again. First, the dog didn't respond. Then, with a faint twitch of its nose, it stretched its neck forward and lapped at the water. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. While the dog drank, Jack took a closer look. Its fur was matted and dirty, and there were scars visible along its back and legs, some old, others more recent. Around its neck was a faint indentation where a collar might have once been. The skin rubbed raw beneath. "You've been through some real shit," Jack said, shaking his head. He reached out cautiously, brushing his hand over the dog's head. It flinched slightly but didn't pull away, its eyes flicking up to meet his for just a moment. Jack rose again, moving to the pantry where he rummaged through his sparse supplies. He found a can of chicken soup, the simplest thing he could think of to coax the dog into eating. As he worked, his mind raced with questions. Where had this dog come from? How had it survived the storm? And why had it ended up at his cabin, miles from anywhere? He returned with the soup, pouring a small amount into a dish and setting it beside the dog. "Come on, buddy, eat something," he encouraged. The dog sniffed the bowl tentatively before lapping at the broth, its movements slow and deliberate. Jack watched silently, a strange warmth stirring in his chest. It had been a long time since he'd cared about anything or anyone other than himself. Yet this dog, battered and broken as it was, stirred something in him he thought he'd buried long ago. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows. Jack glanced toward the door, unease prickling at the back of his neck. Something about this felt too coincidental. He shook the thought away, telling himself he was being paranoid. Just as he turned back to the dog, a sound made him freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, a soft scratching at the door, followed by a high-pitched whimper. Jack's heart pounded. Slowly, he stood and moved toward the door. The German Shepherd's ears twitched at the sound, though it didn't move. When Jack opened the door, the cold hit him like a slap. Standing in the snow was another dog, a smaller one, trembling violently. The smaller dog stood just outside the door, its thin frame shaking from the cold. Its fur was a mix of white and black, coated with frost, and its eyes were wide with fear. Jack stared at it for a moment, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath. He crouched down, extending a hand toward the trembling animal. "Come here, it's okay," he said softly, his tone steady but coaxing. The dog hesitated, taking a tentative step forward before collapsing onto the snow. Without thinking, Jack lunged forward and scooped the animal into his arms. Its body was just as frigid as the German Shepherd's had been, the bones sharp beneath its thin coat. He carried the smaller dog inside, kicking the door shut behind him to block out the howling wind. The German Shepherd, still lying near the fire, lifted its head weakly, its ears twitching at the new arrival. Jack placed the smaller dog on the rug beside the first, quickly wrapping it in another blanket. "What the hell is going on here?" he muttered, glancing between the two animals. It didn't make sense, two dogs, both in dire condition, showing up at his cabin in the middle of a brutal storm. The smaller dog whimpered softly, its eyes darting around the room before settling on the German Shepherd. The larger dog let out a low, almost imperceptible rumble, and the smaller one stretched its neck toward it, nuzzling its face into the larger dog's side. Jack paused, watching the interaction with a mix of curiosity and unease. "You two know each other, don't you?" he said, more to himself than to the dogs. He grabbed another bowl, filling it with lukewarm water and placing it near the smaller dog. It sniffed at the water weakly before lapping at it, its movements slow but deliberate. Jack sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't a coincidence. Couldn't be. These dogs hadn't just stumbled onto his cabin by chance. Something or someone had driven them here. The thought sent a chill down his spine, colder than the wind outside. He looked toward the door, then at the windows, half expecting to see a shadow moving beyond the glass. But there was nothing, only the relentless storm outside. Returning his attention to the dogs, Jack noticed something else. The smaller dog didn't have the same scars as the German Shepherd, but its coat was tangled, and its paws were raw, as if it had been running for miles on rough terrain. "What the hell happened to you two?" Jack asked, his voice quieter now. He reached out cautiously, running a hand over the smaller dog's back. It didn't flinch, leaning slightly into his touch. For the first time in years, Jack felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose. These dogs needed him, and deep down, he suspected he needed them just as much. Jack leaned back against the edge of the sofa, his eyes fixed on the two dogs now huddled together near the fire. The larger German Shepherd, whom he'd mentally started calling Hero, seemed to take on a protective role, keeping the smaller dog nestled against its side. Hero's ears twitched occasionally, as though it were still alert despite its exhausted state. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind battering the cabin walls with relentless fury. Jack's unease grew. Something wasn't right. These dogs weren't just strays wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. There was a story here, one he couldn't yet piece together. Jack's gaze shifted to Hero's neck, where the faint indentation of a collar was still visible. The mark looked raw, as though the collar had been removed recently, and not gently. He leaned closer, inspecting it under the flickering firelight. "What were you wearing?" he muttered. "And who took it off you?" As his fingers traced the edges of the scarred skin, Hero's eyes flicked open. The dog didn't flinch or pull away, instead meeting Jack's gaze with an intensity that made his chest tighten. It was a look Jack recognized, one of pain, survival, and a silent plea for help. Pushing himself up, Jack moved to the small wooden table near the kitchen and retrieved an old flashlight. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with," he muttered, grabbing his heavy coat and boots. Hero's ears perked up, and the smaller dog let out a faint whine as Jack approached the door. He paused, looking back at the pair. "Relax, I'm just checking something," he said, more to reassure himself than the dogs. Jack stepped outside, the cold slamming into him like a wall. The snow had piled high against the cabin, and visibility was limited to just a few feet ahead. He scanned the ground with the flashlight, his breath coming out in visible puffs as he crouched to examine the area around his porch. It didn't take long to spot the tracks. There were paw prints, two sets, one large and one smaller, leading directly to his door. But what made his stomach knot was the third set of tracks. Human footprints. They were faint, partially covered by fresh snow, but unmistakable. Someone had been here. Jack straightened, his flashlight beam sweeping across the tree line. The forest loomed dark and silent, the trees swaying ominously in the storm. He felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing by. They had led these dogs to him. He turned back toward the cabin, his mind racing. As he stepped inside, Hero's eyes followed him intently. The smaller dog had fallen asleep, his breathing now steady. Jack leaned against the door, his jaw clenched. "All right," he said softly, more to himself than the dogs. "What the hell is going on here?" For the first time in years, Jack felt something beyond his usual solitude, a creeping sense that he was no longer alone, and that whatever had brought these dogs to his doorstep was only the beginning. The storm raged on through the night, but inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, its warmth wrapping the room in a fragile sense of safety. Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at the footprints he had sketched out on a scrap of paper. 2 sets of paw prints, 1 set of human tracks. He tapped the pencil against the table, his mind racing. What kind of person would abandon dogs in a storm like this? And why lead them to his cabin? He glanced at Hero, who was now sitting upright by the fire, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the cabin. The smaller dog was still curled up, fast asleep, but Hero seemed restless, as if it was keeping watch. "You know something I don't." "Ha!" Jack muttered, his voice breaking the silence. Hero's ears perked at the sound, and the dog turned its head to meet Jack's gaze. It was unnerving how intelligent the animal seemed, almost as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Pushing his chair back, Jack stood and moved to the window. He brushed aside the frost on the glass, peering out into the darkness. The snow had lessened slightly, but the wind still howled through the trees, bending their skeletal branches. The faint tracks he'd seen earlier were likely gone by now, buried under fresh snow. A sudden noise made Jack spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. It was a soft sound, just a faint scuff of movement, but enough to send his pulse racing. "Hero," Jack called softly. The German Shepherd was already on its feet, standing stiff and alert, his gaze locked on the door. The noise came again, this time louder, a deliberate scratching at the door, followed by a low, guttural growl. Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. Jack moved cautiously to the door, gripping the knife tightly in one hand. Hero followed closely, his body tense, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. "Stay back," Jack whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Hero or himself. He unlatched the door and opened it just a crack, enough to see outside. The cold hit him instantly, but he barely noticed it. His eyes scanned the darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the snow. Nothing. Jack stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching against the snow. He swung the flashlight in a slow arc, illuminating the trees and the snow-covered yard. Still nothing. Then, just as he turned to step back inside, he saw it, a shadowy figure at the edge of the tree line. Jack froze, his breath clouding in the freezing air as his flashlight beam lingered on the shadowy figure. It was just barely visible through the falling snow, standing at the edge of the tree line, motionless. His pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Who's there?" Jack called, his voice firm despite the unease creeping up his spine. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the white expanse of snow. Jack tightened his grip on the knife, his flashlight shaking slightly in his other hand. Hero let out a low growl from behind him, stepping onto the porch with slow, deliberate movements. The German Shepherd's body was rigid, his ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the figure in the distance. "I'm warning you," Jack said, taking a cautious step forward. "If you've got any sense, you'll walk away right now." The figure shifted slightly, just enough to make Jack's heart leap. But instead of approaching or retreating, it turned and disappeared into the darkness of the trees. Jack stood there for a moment, his breath shallow as he scanned the forest. The snow had already begun to cover any tracks the figure might have left, erasing its presence almost as quickly as it appeared. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, backing toward the cabin. Once inside, Jack locked the door and pushed a heavy chair against it for good measure. Hero stayed close, pacing back and forth in front of the door, its growls tapering off into quiet huffs. The smaller dog stirred from its sleep, lifting its head groggily to watch the commotion. Jack leaned against the wall, his mind racing. "That wasn't just someone passing by," he said aloud, more to himself than the dogs. "Whoever that was, they knew exactly where to find this place." His eyes fell to Hero, who had stopped pacing and was now sitting by the door, staring at it intently as if expecting the figure to return. Jack rubbed a hand over his face, trying to shake off the adrenaline. He grabbed the flashlight again and turned toward the kitchen. intending to check the back door and the windows. As he passed by the table, something caught his eye. A piece of paper lying just beneath the front window, partially hidden by the edge of the rug. Frowning, Jack bent down to pick it up. The paper was damp from the snow, the ink smeared but still legible. A single sentence was scrawled across it in messy handwriting. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." Jack stared at the note, the weight of its message sinking in. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about two stray dogs. He was caught in something much bigger and far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Jack gripped the note tightly, his knuckles whitening as his mind raced. The handwriting was rough, the message blunt. Someone had been here, close enough to leave the note without him noticing, and they weren't afraid to make their intentions clear. He moved to the table and set the note down, staring at it under the dim glow of the overhead light. "Stay out of this," he muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. "Stay out of what?" Hero let out a low growl from its position by the door, drawing Jack's attention. The dog's ears were perked, its eyes locked on the window as if sensing something Jack couldn't see. "Relax, boy," Jack said, though his own unease was growing. He reached for his rifle, hanging on a rack near the back door. It wasn't often that he needed it, but tonight, he felt an undeniable sense of urgency. With the rifle slung over his shoulder, Jack grabbed his flashlight and gestured toward Hero. "Let's go," he said. The dog immediately stood, its tail stiff as it followed Jack to the door. The storm had eased slightly, the wind no longer howling but still carrying a biting chill. Jack stepped out cautiously, scanning the area with his flashlight. The yard was empty, the fresh snow glistening under the faint light of the moon. Hero stayed close to Jack's side, its movements deliberate and focused. The smaller dog remained inside, too weak to follow, its eyes watching from the warm safety of the cabin. Jack followed the faint remnants of tracks leading away from the porch. The snow had partially covered them, but they were still visible enough to follow, a mix of human footprints and paw prints. The trail led him deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser and the air colder. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of Jack's boots and Hero's soft padding through the snow. After several minutes, Jack's flashlight beam landed on something unusual. A small clearing appeared ahead, and in the center was a dilapidated wooden structure, a shed, half collapsed under the weight of the snow. Jack hesitated, his grip tightening on the flashlight. The tracks led straight to the shed, their faint impressions disappearing into the shadows beneath its sagging roof. Hero stepped forward, sniffing the air cautiously before letting out a short bark. The sound echoed through the clearing, unnervingly loud in the stillness of the night. Jack swallowed hard and moved closer, his flashlight sweeping over the shed's exterior. The wood was weathered and rotting, the windows opaque with grime. He reached for the door handle, the cold metal biting into his skin. As he pushed the door open, the hinges let out a long, grating creak. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the grim contents inside. Cages, 4 of them, lined up against the far wall. Jack's stomach churned as he stepped inside. The cages were empty now, but the scattered remnants, chewed up blankets, broken bowls, and matted fur told a haunting story of what had been here. "This isn't random," Jack muttered, his voice barely audible over his pounding heartbeat. Behind him, Hero let out another low growl, and Jack turned sharply, flashlight darting toward the shed's doorway. He wasn't alone. Jack whipped around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness beyond the shed's doorway. His pulse thundered in his ears as he strained to see into the shadows. Hero stood rigid, its body blocking the entrance, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. "Who's out there?" Jack barked, his voice echoing in the stillness. He raised the rifle, its weight steady in his hands despite the tension coiling in his muscles. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the forest. Then, a faint crunch of snow broke the silence. Jack's flashlight darted toward the sound, landing on a figure standing just beyond the clearing. It was the same shadowy figure from before, now slightly closer but still obscured by the trees. Jack squinted, trying to make out any defining features, but the figure stepped back into the deeper shadows, as if deliberately avoiding the light. "Show yourself," Jack shouted, his voice firm but edged with frustration. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the forest, its movements swift and deliberate. Jack lowered his rifle slightly, his teeth clenched in irritation. Whoever this was, they were playing games, and he didn't have the patience for it. Hero's growling ceased, but the dog remained tense, its ears twitching as it listened intently. Jack glanced down at the German Shepherd, then back at the shed. "Come on," he muttered, stepping inside the structure again. The cages lined against the far wall were rusted and bent, their doors ajar as if whatever had been held inside had escaped or been freed. Jack crouched to examine the floor near one of the cages, his flashlight illuminating fresh scratch marks on the wooden planks. "These dogs," he murmured to himself. "They were kept here." A metallic glint caught his eye, and he reached out to pick up a small object from the ground. It was a broken piece of a leash, the leather frayed as though it had been chewed through. Jack's stomach churned as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Whoever had brought Hero and the smaller dog to his cabin wasn't just abandoning them. They were running from something, or someone, just as Jack stood. A sound behind him made him spin around, his rifle raised instinctively. The door to the shed slammed shut, plunging the interior into near-total darkness. Hero barked sharply, his powerful voice echoing in the confined space. Jack lunged for the door, shoving it open with his shoulder. The cold air rushed in as he stumbled into the clearing, his flashlight beam frantically searching for any sign of movement. The clearing was empty, but Jack's sense of relief was short-lived. A voice, low and mocking, drifted out from the shadows of the forest. "You should have stayed out of this." Jack's grip on the rifle tightened as he spun toward the source of the voice. The words lingered in the freezing air, taunting him. Hero stood beside him, his growl deepening, his body coiled like a spring. "Who are you?" Jack shouted into the darkness, his voice sharp and commanding. "What do you want?" The only response was silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the wind briefly dying down as if nature itself was waiting for something to happen. Jack's eyes darted around, scanning the treeline for any sign of movement, but whoever had spoken was either gone or hidden too well to spot. Beside him, Hero barked sharply, his ears pinned forward, nose pointing toward the trees to the left. Jack adjusted his flashlight in that direction, the beam cutting through the swirling snow. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. "I'm done playing your games," Jack bellowed, taking a step toward the forest. Before he could go further, Hero lunged forward, barking with ferocious intensity. Jack turned just in time to see another figure darting out from behind the shed, moving toward the treeline. It was smaller than the first, quicker, and clearly trying to avoid detection. "Not so fast," Jack muttered under his breath. He raised the rifle, aiming for the ground near the figure, and fired a warning shot. The deafening crack of the rifle echoed through the clearing, causing the figure to freeze mid-step. "Don't move," Jack commanded, his voice hard. Hero snarled beside him, his teeth bared, ready to attack at the slightest sign of aggression. The figure hesitated, then slowly raised their hands in surrender. As Jack approached, flashlight trained on the person. He saw a young man, probably in his early 20s, dressed in ragged clothes, his face pale and gaunt from the cold. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Jack demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I didn't want any trouble," the man stammered, his breath visible in the icy air. "I was just trying to help the dogs." Jack frowned, lowering the rifle slightly. "You're the one who brought them to my cabin?" The man nodded, shivering violently. "Yes, I couldn't take care of them anymore, but I didn't think you'd get involved like this." They weren't supposed to be found. Found by who? Jack interrupted, stepping closer. What's going on here? The young man hesitated, glancing nervously toward the forest. They'll kill me if they find out I talked, he muttered. Jack's patience snapped. He grabbed the man by the collar, pulling him closer. You brought them to my door, and now I'm stuck in the middle of this mess. Start talking, or I'll let Hero finish what I won't. Hero barked again, as if on cue, and the young man flinched. All right. I worked for them, a group running illegal dogfights. The German Shepherd, Hero, was one of their top fighters. I couldn't watch it anymore, so I took them and ran. Jack's grip loosened slightly as the weight of the man's words sank in. And now they're coming for you and the dogs. The man nodded, his eyes filled with fear. They don't let anyone walk away. Jack's jaw tightened as he processed the young man's words. The storm, the dogs, the shadowy figures in the forest. It all pointed to something far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Who are they? Jack demanded, his voice low but forceful. The young man swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the treeline. A group of men, they run underground dog fights. Hero was their star fighter, and the smaller dog was supposed to be trained next. I couldn't watch it anymore. I thought if I got them away, it'd be enough. But it wasn't, Jack said flatly. The man nodded, his shoulders slumping. They don't care about the dogs. To them, it's all money and power, and they don't let anyone get in their way. Jack exhaled sharply, his breath fogging in the cold night air. He glanced at Hero, who was still standing guard, its intense gaze fixed on the trembling young man. The dog's scars suddenly made sense. A lifetime of fighting, forced into brutality for someone else's profit. You put me and these dogs in their crosshairs, Jack said, his tone hard. Now you're going to help me fix it. The young man's eyes widened. No, I can't. You don't have a choice, Jack interrupted, his voice sharp. He stepped closer, his flashlight beam glaring into the man's face. You know where they are. You know what they'll do. You either stand with me, or you get out there and face them alone. The man hesitated, his lips trembling as he considered his options. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. Okay, he said weakly. There's a camp, not far from here, deep in the forest. That's where they keep the dogs. How many of them are there? Jack asked. 4, maybe 5. The man replied. They're armed, and they're ruthless. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. He'd faced danger before, fires that threatened to consume him, chaos that demanded courage. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about justice for the dogs who had suffered, and for the 2 who had found their way to his door. We move at first light, Jack said firmly, turning back toward the cabin. What? The young man stammered, his panic rising. You're going after them? Jack glanced over his shoulder, his expression steely. Damn right I am. They're not walking away from this. The man followed Jack into the cabin, his nervous energy palpable. Hero and the smaller dog watched from their place by the fire, their eyes following Jack as he set his rifle down and began preparing for the coming confrontation. As Jack double-checked his gear, the weight of what lay ahead settled over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself or the dogs. He was fighting to stop something far darker, something that thrived on cruelty and exploitation. The storm outside had eased, but a different storm was brewing inside Jack's chest. Tomorrow, he would bring the fight to them. The forest was eerily silent as dawn broke, the fresh snow crunching softly under Jack's boots. Hero walked beside him, the steps deliberate and silent, ears pricked forward in constant alert. Behind them, the young man stumbled to keep up, his breath fogging in the icy morning air. Jack adjusted the strap of his rifle, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. The young man had been reluctant to lead them to the camp, but fear of Jack and the men hunting him had convinced him otherwise. It's not far now, the man whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack glanced back at him. "Stay quiet. We don't want them knowing we're coming." The three pressed deeper into the forest, the canopy of trees above blocking out most of the weak sunlight. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the tension coiling tighter with every step. Hero moved with purpose, its nose twitching as it picked up faint scents on the wind. Finally, they reached the edge of a small clearing. Jack crouched low, motioning for the others to do the same. The young man pointed a trembling finger toward a cluster of ramshackle structures in the distance, a series of makeshift cabins and metal cages partially hidden by tarps. "There," the man whispered, his voice shaking. "That's where they keep the dogs." Jack surveyed the camp through the scope of his rifle. He counted 3 men visible outside, each armed and moving between the cabins. 2 were smoking, laughing loudly, while the third appeared to be pacing near the largest structure, his expression impatient. "How many inside?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Probably 2 more," the young man replied. "One of them handles the dogs. He's the worst." Jack's jaw clenched. "Stay here," he said, fixing the man with a hard stare. "Don't move unless I tell you." The man nodded quickly, sinking lower into the snow. Jack turned to Hero, placing a hand on the dog's head. "Stay close," he murmured. Hero's eyes met his, steady and resolute, as though it understood exactly what was about to happen. Jack moved forward, staying low as he circled the clearing, using the trees as cover. Hero followed without a sound, his body low to the ground, every muscle tense. When they reached the edge of the camp, Jack paused, his rifle raised as he scoped out the closest target, a man standing near one of the cages, his back turned. Jack's finger hovered over the trigger, but he stopped short when he heard the faint sound of whimpering. His eyes shifted to the cages. Inside were 3 dogs, each emaciated and trembling, their eyes filled with fear. One of them looked like it could barely stand, its legs shaking beneath it. Jack's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a rescue. Jack's heart tightened as he watched the dogs in the cages. Their condition was worse than he'd imagined. Ribs visible beneath matted fur, eyes hollow with fear and exhaustion. His grip on the rifle tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Rushing in without a plan would only get them all killed. He glanced at Hero, who crouched beside him, its amber eyes locked on the camp. Jack leaned closer to the dog, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll get them out, but I need you to stay ready." Hero didn't make a sound, his focus unwavering. Jack shifted his attention back to the men. The one nearest the cages had turned, casually strolling toward the other 2 who were still chatting and smoking. It was his chance, using the noise of their conversation as cover. Jack moved swiftly, staying low as he approached the cages. Hero followed closely, his paws barely making a sound on the snow. When they reached the nearest cage, Jack knelt down, his eyes scanning the lock. It was rusted but intact. Breaking it would make too much noise. He glanced at the trembling dog inside, a small black and white mutt that flinched at his approach. "It's okay," Jack whispered, his voice soft and steady. "I'm here to help." The dog whimpered quietly, pressing itself into the corner of the cage. Jack's stomach twisted, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He turned to Hero, motioning for the dog to stay put, then crept toward the next cage. As he worked, the sound of raised voices caught his attention. Jack froze, his head snapping toward the largest cabin. The pacing man had stepped out, his angry voice cutting through the air as he barked orders at the others. Jack couldn't make out every word, but one phrase was clear: "Find him before he brings the cops." Jack's eyes darted toward the young man hiding at the treeline. He was still crouched low, but his visible shaking made him look like a leaf caught in the wind. Jack cursed under his breath. If the men in the camp spotted him, this would turn into a bloodbath. One of the men near the fire started walking toward the cages, a shotgun slung over his shoulder. Jack tensed, his mind racing. He couldn't take them all out at once. But if they discovered him now, The dogs wouldn't stand a chance. Just as the man reached the first cage, Hero sprang into action. The dog launched itself forward with a ferocious bark, catching the man completely off guard. He stumbled backward, shouting in alarm as Hero lunged, teeth bared. Jack seized the opportunity, raising his rifle and firing a single shot into the air. The camp erupted into chaos, the other men scrambling for their weapons as Hero kept the first one pinned to the ground. "Get the dogs!" Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the mayhem. "Now!" The air erupted with shouts and chaos as Jack moved swiftly toward the cages. Hero had the first man pinned, its teeth bared in a snarl that froze the others in their tracks for a split second. Jack used the distraction, his rifle raised and aimed squarely at the nearest armed man. "Drop it!" Jack barked, his voice cutting through the noise. The man hesitated, his hands hovering near the pistol at his side. Jack took a step forward, his eyes cold and unyielding. "I said drop it. Now!" With a curse, the man tossed the weapon into the snow, raising his hands. Jack motioned toward the cages. "Move!" he ordered. "Get those dogs out." The man looked confused but didn't argue. He stumbled toward the cages, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the locks. Meanwhile, the other men began to regroup, their shouts growing louder as they scrambled to take control of the situation. Hero barked sharply, snapping at the legs of the pinned man as he tried to reach for a knife. The German shepherd's sheer ferocity kept him subdued, and Jack's confidence in the dog grew with every second. "Keep him there, Hero," Jack called out, moving to another cage. He quickly unlocked it, letting out a large, trembling hound. The dog stumbled out, confused and frightened, but Jack guided it toward the tree-line where the young man was still hiding. "Take it," Jack yelled, pointing to the hound. The young man nodded frantically, grabbing the dog's leash and pulling it to safety. Jack turned back toward the camp, where the remaining men were now regrouping near the largest cabin. A shotgun blast rang out, the sound deafening. Jack dove behind one of the empty cages, the snow around him exploding from the blast. Hero let out a fierce bark, darting back toward Jack's side as the pinned man finally scrambled away. Jack peeked out from behind the cage, firing a warning shot into the air. "Enough!" he shouted. "You want to walk away? Leave now." For a moment, the men hesitated. Then one of them, the apparent leader, stepped forward, his expression dark. "You think you can just take what's ours?" he snarled. "This isn't over." Jack didn't flinch. "The only thing that's over is your little operation. Cops are on their way." He bluffed, his voice steady. "Run while you can." The leader glared at him, weighing his options. Finally, with a curse, he motioned for the others to retreat. They disappeared into the forest, leaving Jack, Hero, and the freed dogs behind. As silence settled over the camp, Jack stood, his chest heaving. He glanced at Hero, who sat beside him, panting but alert. "You did good, buddy," Jack said, his voice softer now. The young man emerged from the trees, leading the rescued dogs. His face was pale, but his eyes held a spark of relief. "What now?" he asked shakily. Jack looked at the dogs, then at the retreating footprints of the men. "Now we make sure this never happens again." The camp was eerily silent now, the snow settling once again over the chaos left behind. Jack stood in the middle of the clearing, his breath visible in the cold air, rifle still in hand. The adrenaline in his veins had begun to fade, replaced by the heavy weight of what had just transpired. Hero walked slowly to his side, its ears twitching as it scanned the surroundings one last time. The German shepherd's scars seemed to glisten in the pale light of dawn, a stark reminder of everything it had endured. Jack knelt down, resting a hand on Hero's head. "We're not done yet, boy," he murmured. The young man approached cautiously, leading the rescued dogs. Their movements were slow, their bodies weak, but there was a new glimmer of hope in their eyes. Jack met the young man's gaze, his own expression grim. "You said there were more camps. Jack said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The young man hesitated, then nodded. This isn't the only one. They move the dogs around, keep them hidden. There's a network, and they don't stop unless someone makes them. Jack exhaled slowly, his mind already working through the next steps. He glanced at the dogs, each one a survivor of unimaginable cruelty, and felt a renewed sense of purpose stirring in his chest. We're going to take them down, Jack said firmly. Every last one of them. The young man's eyes widened. You can't do this alone. These people, they'll come for you, for us. Jack stood, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. Then we'll make sure they don't get the chance. First, we get these dogs somewhere safe. After that, we fight back. Hero barked softly, as if in agreement. Jack looked down at the dog, a small smile breaking through the hardness in his expression. Come on, he said. We've got work to do. Weeks later, the cabin felt less like a solitary refuge and more like a command center. Jack had turned his home into a sanctuary for the rescued dogs, patching up their wounds and giving them the care they'd been denied for so long. Hero had taken on the role of protector, watching over the smaller dogs with an almost parental vigilance. The young man, though still nervous, had stayed to help, learning from Jack how to care for the animals and prepare for what lay ahead. Jack sat at the table, a map spread out before him, marked with red circles denoting suspected locations of other camps. Each mark represented a fight he was determined to win, not just for the dogs he'd saved, but for those still trapped. A knock at the door startled him. Jack reached for his rifle instinctively, but Hero was already at the door, growling softly. Easy, boy, Jack said, standing cautiously. When he opened the door, there was no one there, just an envelope pinned to the wooden frame. Jack pulled it free, his gut tightening as he unfolded the paper inside. The note was short, scrawled in the same messy handwriting as before. This isn't over. We'll be watching. Jack stared at the note for a long moment, then crumpled it in his fist. His eyes shifted to Hero, whose steady gaze seemed to say everything Jack needed to hear. No, it's not over, Jack said quietly, but we'll be ready. The story ends with a powerful reminder of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Jack's journey becomes not just a fight against cruelty, but a testament to the impact of standing up for those who cannot defend themselves. Through Hero's scars and loyalty, and Jack's determination, the message is clear. Even in the face of overwhelming darkness, hope and justice can prevail.